Hi, folks. Welcome to Mythborn Live. I hope you enjoyed today's show. It's going to be awesome. And I am always looking for new subjects, so please comment, let me know what you want to hear, and like, subscribe, share.
All good. I know what I was going to ask you.
Very excited.
So I really was impressed with the architecture of story for gaming, and I want you to tell us a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, it's a humbling process to write anything. When you start, you think you know where you're going, and more times than once, I felt like the guy who painted himself into a corner, trying to get out of that room and not mess up. But what was really nice is that I had this toolkit to pull on from my video game development days. And as you correctly noted, games development is a very expensive process. And while we can't demand our artists are creative every single day, we try and come up with tools to help them maximize their ability to be creative, when the creative bone hits. And when it doesn't, we give them a toolkit of things they can reach back to keep themselves excited. So I found myself falling back on that 30 years of training in video games to help me in the creative process. And for the most part, I think it worked out well. I painted myself into corners less often after using it.
So when you started gaming, did you realize that it would require that much writing? I mean, as an outsider, I don't think of that. I don't look at them and say, oh, there's a lot of writing in this. I know there's worlds created. So tell me if you were that surprised you when you started gaming.
When I first got into video games, I was floored by the amount of writing that would be necessary in order to build these worlds. I had been a kid who played a lot of role-playing games, and I took it sort of, along in a normal way that there'd be some writing involved when you're going to create a story about an adventure. But most of what we did there was off the top of our heads. When you plan out a video game, for instance, when I did Elder Scrolls, I think I wrote 5 novels worth of writing, well over 500,000 words in terms of the amount of writing that I had to do. Mainly because, unlike a novel that you read from start to finish, in games we have these pesky things called players, and they will try and do things you didn't expect them to do. And so we had to write in such a way as to always give them something interesting to do if they decided to go off the beaten path. And so a number of concepts came to bear when it came to video game development, and just part and parcel with that was I was writing novels worth of writing over and over again, and I would say before I ever wrote my first novel, I may have put well over a million words down, that never went into a novel that got published.
Was there a point in your video development career that you said, I want to write a book?
About halfway through my video development career, the urge to write for writing's sake certainly struck. One of the things that people don't realize about writing, about video game development, and I suspect they don't realize this when they think about movies development either, and that is that there's a giant team of people who are working on the product. And the idea that one person's view or vision is going to actually make it all the way to the end is, it's not the best form of creative development. You want your best artists doing the artwork, and you want your best writers writing things, and you want your best designers coming up with the things that they come up with, because that's where they're really, really good at what they do. So what ends up happening is you do get a version of what you came up with in video games, but it's changed, it's been tweaked, it's been, a lot of fingers have been in the pie. And what you get, you hope, is better than the sum of any single person's contribution. And I think for the most part, it absolutely is. But writing is a very singular, private thing. And I found myself, after a number of video game titles under my belt, loving the collaborative process I got during the day, but at night wanting to do something for myself. And writing was that escape that I gave myself.
So did you always have this wild imagination that can just walk into space and see a world?
When I was a really small child, my mother was told that I needed to be occupied all the time mainly because my imagination and my mouth wouldn't stop. I had this need to just explain everything around me, and if I couldn't explain it, I would tell a story about it, and if I couldn't tell it with a story, I'd write a picture about it. I was just constantly creating this make-believe world around me. And, you know, I think my mom, it really struck her when we were on a plane once. I'll never forget this. I was 5 years old, and I hadn't stopped talking since we had gotten on the flight about how the plane was going to take off and how it was going to fly. And finally, my mom, any mom gets exasperated at some point. She's like, can you please just put your seatbelt on and let's get ready for our launch. And a gentleman sitting behind us, unbeknownst to my mom, had been listening, and he leaned forward and he said to my mom, do you know that your son, who's 5, just explained correctly the aerodynamics of lift that we're about to do? Like, he's clearly read about it, and he's excited. I wouldn't shut that down. And my mom was like, well, then you can have him. She was kidding. But it was I've always been a person who, my brain has been working overtime.
And how do you, you live in a world with a boatload of characters that live in alternate realities and in different ways and with different clothes and housing and relationships. How do they all live in you? How does that work in VJ?
Having dozens of characters all living inside of me and seeing how they eventually make it onto the page, I wish I could say it's because I have some kind of special talent. I don't think I do. I think I use some of the tips and tricks that we use in video games development to organize what is a chaotic creative process. So one of the things I have adopted for novel writing is conflict maps. In video games, I used to create conflict maps of characters, and I'd be looking for triangles. Once I put all these people down as nodes on a piece of sheet of paper, and I connected the nodes based on with colored lines on whether they liked each other or not, I started looking for triangles of a certain color, because those triangles meant that would be a conflict moment if they met. And if I could keep them in mind, I could create interesting conflict amongst them. So what I would do then is, it's hard to remember all the places in which you have opportunity when you're writing. It's such a vast possibility space that I started listing like all the conflicts, like, my main character with the dragon, my dragon and the sword, and all these things were listed down in terms of what would be really interesting down to maybe not so interesting. And once I ranked them, whenever I was at a loss for what was going on, or I was about to write a chapter, I knew which characters were going in. I would just look at my conflict map and say, where is there opportunity for conflict, and how can I work it in? So that was a process that really helped me tie down the way in which I had these characters come to life.
So do they speak to you, these characters? Do they tell you where they want to go?
What shocked me the most in writing was how my characters would speak to me at times, but not do what I wanted. And so I would end up with this really clear idea in my head that we're going to go, here to X, point X. And during the process of writing, it became very clear that character was like, are you kidding? That's like, I'm not doing that. and she or he would go in a different direction, and I would let it go. I would let the writing write itself. In some ways, it was almost like they were inside of me and they were writing their story. And when every time I let that happen, I've never been disappointed. It's always been something I didn't expect, but that some portion of my brain must have known the way I was doing it was a square peg in a round hole, and the way they wanted to do it was much more organic and much more real. And I think that's why I've gotten positive feedback on my characters being interesting and dynamic, and not being not having the what I consider to be sort of the death note in old in sort of the old style of fantasy, where you had to have the character do something, so there would just be a scene pop up for no reason in which that thing happened. It's very artificial.
So I'm curious, do you like knock on a door, the door opens, and there is Mythborn world?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it something that you just say, I'm going to take a step, and there's some ground, and there's a rock, and is it a map of discovery, or is it something that you see in its full entirety, or how much of it is discovered in writing?
So when I sit down to think about writing, today, and some of this is lessons learned, and I think about how to create a world, how to step into bringing a world to life. I wish it were opening a door and boom, there's Mythborn, and I could just start. It's never that. Typically, what I end up doing is I draw myself a map, literally like a cartographer would, of the world I know that I want to talk about, and the places that I know the best, I draw the most detail into. And that map helps me ground my creative brain into thinking about this world as a real place. And once I can think of it as a real place and not an imaginary place, it becomes much easier for me to write all the strata necessary to bring the world to life. The stuff on top that we read is really it's sort of the icing of the cake. Below it is a lot of firmament that needs to be well thought out so that people believe the world itself is real. And some tools we use to do that are thinking about how different characters react to certain things, working in motivations that aren't just primarily visual, but also stimulate the other senses, like sound or hearing or touch. So bringing the world to life is for me a gradual process that I think of it as concentric rings. I start really close to where I'm comfortable, and then I move the rings wider and wider, and the world becomes more and more real as I do that.
So you've got a lot of compliments on your work, but there's also a lot of the fight scenes have this kind of visceral, it's almost, your brain starts thinking about fighting in a different way. There is an authenticity there that I'd love you to explain. It's like, your training and how that translates into being able to articulate what you've lived through so much of your life.
So with Mythborn and the fight scenes, I have the benefit of a lifetime of training in the martial arts. When I was 9 years old, I grew up in Bangkok, Thailand. My dad took me to a martial arts exhibition. I think part of it was the thing I was saying earlier about my mom and me talking all the time and constantly, my brain constantly working. I think my dad's goal was to get me tired during the day so that nighttime would be a little more peaceful. But as soon as I started doing the martial arts, I loved it. I remember thinking one day my instructor yelled at me and he's like, why are you even come here? Who makes you come here? Like, in a weird way. And I remember looking at him with a strange expression like, no, I come here because I want to be here. And I think that's what he wanted to see, out of me. Martial arts is a very disciplined way of understanding body kinematics and how people move, kinesthetics, and how things sort of work. I think Mythborn benefited because in most real fights, it's not really a long, drawn-out process, not at least amongst people who know what they're doing. It's much faster when you have a person who doesn't know what they're doing against someone who does know what they're doing. That's where martial arts got so much of its sort of mythical standing. But the fact is, anyone who trains every day just punching in the air, and they do 9,000 strikes a day, every day, for 20 years, they're going to punch really well. And our system, I did 9,600 strikes a day, every day, for 30 years. So you're going to get good at anything you do like that. You don't need a secret teacher or anything. This is repetition.
How do you take it from the mat to the page?
That is something, when I sit down to write fight scenes in Mythborn, taking it from the mat to the page is something that I think I got lucky when it comes to being able to write that well. I don't know exactly what the technique is I use, but I do know that I'm a very visual person. And so I write the scene the way I see it. I write the punch the way that I see it happening in the speed that I see it happening. I use as few words as possible to describe what I need to describe. And because I'm visual and because I'm watching it play out in my mind's eye, and I'm writing what I see, what I think is a really long scene ends up actually being quite fast to read and very, very sort of brutal and honest and quick. And I think people respond to that because to them it feels like they were in that fight right then. Because for us, when you're in it and someone's throwing punches at you, it seems like it takes an eternity, and then you realize, it's also gone by like that. And so I think that gets captured well in the writing in Mythborn so far. We'll see where it goes.
So visually, do you see the 9,600 hits that you took over? I mean, is it
Huh.
something that you actually are there remembering? I mean, because it really has an authentic experience, both in the punch and the receiving of a punch.
When I'm setting up a fight scene in Mythborn, I absolutely am in the scene. My head is in the scene. I am either the attacker or the defender, and I am carrying out a technique as I have been trained to do it, and also what would work in that situation. I'm influenced by the character who's writing, who I'm writing. So in some cases, certain of them have idiosyncrasies or styles that are not necessarily, endemic to me. But I don't ever forget that. But when that punch is thrown, the response that happens is the writing of a 50-degree black belt, and there's an authenticity there because there is. No one likes to get punched, so you don't forget it often. you remember every feeling. You remember the coppery taste of blood. You remember the smell. You remember the fact that you can't hear as well for a second. You remember the graying out on the edges of your vision. You remember all these little tiny details. And as you go through your writing exercise and any writing 101, and if you hit every single sense with one descriptor of it, believe me, it's going to feel real to the person reading it. That's, in that sense, that's the easier part of the writing is to hit all the senses with a punch.
Hey folks, thanks for joining us for the show. I really enjoy doing these, and I appreciate you, my fans, making it possible. Please like, subscribe, share, and let me know what you want to hear next. Thank you so much. It's your support that makes all this possible. Take care.